Hey guys, Jerome here at 18 Minute Fitness Personal Training Studio in Grafton, Wisconsin. And today I'm going to talk about what everybody gets wrong about isometric exercise and then how to perform it correctly. To get my opinion out there just right away, I believe isometrics, when properly performed, are every single bit as effective and can be significantly safer than conventional exercise protocol. Now, I should probably start by defining what isometric exercise is for those who don't know. Isometric exercise is where there's no movement, and there are two different ways to do it. You can either hold a weight in a steady position. Think of like a plank. They're really popular, right? You kind of get on your forearms, your hands, lift your knees off the ground, kind of like a push-up position, and you hold that there as long as you can, right? And eventually, the muscles of the trunk and possibly the shoulders, arms, lower back fatigue, and you're no longer able to maintain that exercise. That would be an example of what's known as a yielding isometric. You're holding a position or a weight as long as you can in a certain position. The other type is known as overcoming isometrics, and that's when you're pushing or pulling essentially against an immovable object. There's some disagreement on whether some are better for strength and some are better for hypertrophy, which is muscular growth. And I haven't seen any significant body of data to suggest that one is necessarily better than the other. Before I get into how to properly do isometrics, I want to address a few misconceptions about isometric exercise. First is that it's only good for about 10 to 15 degrees around a portion in the range of movement. And let me illustrate this with like a bench press. Power lifters will often use isometrics in certain portions of the range of movement to try and increase strength at that particular sticking point. And I want to break it down and explain why I think the misconception is there in the first place. So if you're bench pressing 400 pounds, it's always going to be 400 pounds. But depending on where that bar is in that particular portion of the range of movement, different muscles are working to varying degrees to try and move that weight. Throughout the first half, maybe 2/3 of the range of movement, it's predominantly the chest muscles. Your elbows are generally a little bit wide, and the chest functions to abduct the humerus or bring it across the midline of the body. As those arms begin to straighten out, you get less direct involvement of the pec muscles, and you get more anterior deltoid and tricep trying to straighten that arm to lock out the lift. Or sorry, I shouldn't say lock out, to try and complete the lift. Anybody who's bench pressed fairly heavy can often feel this point where it goes from being difficult to it almost feels like you can no longer move that weight. It becomes very, very hard at a certain portion of the range of movement. What's happening here? The prime mover is changing from a bigger, stronger muscle group like the pecs into smaller muscle groups like the anterior deltoid and the tricep to try and finish lifting that weight. So what a lot of powerlifters will do is they'll try and train that particular portion of the range of movement by setting like a Smith machine at that particular height, and they'll have a bar and they'll push against it with their arms, whatever that distance is, and they'll push against it as hard as they can for like 7 or maybe 10 seconds. And the thought is that this all out intense effort will build strength in that particular portion of the range of movement. To an extent, I think that's true, but the reason I think that's false is the carryover in that position doesn't happen because you're only working in that particular portion of the range of movement. The carryover with respect to strength is because you were making a more directed, focused effort on strengthening these smaller muscle groups that were previously the limiting factor in trying to complete this lift. If you have stronger triceps, if you have stronger deltoids, if you're more capable of producing force in those particular muscles, you will have more strength in that position of the range of movement. So I think it's a little disingenuous and perhaps a little naive to say that isometrics only carry over to certain portions of the range of movement. The literature certainly doesn't show it. You can go on PubMed and look at isometric exercise compared to conventional exercise, and there are a number of studies that show with respect to strength and muscle size, isometrics is essentially every bit as effective if performed correctly. The second thing that is either a wrong perception or that people get wrong about isometrics is, especially with an overcoming isometric, is that you should only exert maybe like 7 to 10 seconds maximal effort. I believe guys like Athlean X has promoted this, and some other people, when they talk about isometrics, they'll get like a weight that they can't curl on like a cable, and they'll just contract as hard as they can into it for 7 to 10 seconds. You don't want to do this. This is wrong. One, because there's not enough time under tension to adequately fatigue all of the muscle fiber types that are present in that particular muscle group that you're trying to work. But bigger picture, anytime you perform exercise, you should be trying to generate as much intensity as you safely can. Everything starts with safety, and safety comes down to a couple of different things. Namely, one, performing movements that are concordant with muscle and joint function and anatomy, and two, limiting force production on the joints. You don't want a high amount of force. What you want is a high amount of tension and a low amount of force. And the way to think of this is your muscles pull on your connective tissue, which articulates about the joint. So if joint health is something that you want to be acutely aware of long term, you need to exercise in a way that promotes joint safety while also working quite heavily to fatigue and overload the muscles that you're trying to work. If you were to just walk out into the parking lot and you wanted to lift the bumper of a pickup truck and try and scoot it over, like you may have seen Franco Columbu doing in Pumping Iron, it would be wrong to just go back to that bumper, grab it, and then instantly thrust upward as hard as you can. That's a great way to produce an injury. And the way that injuries happen with respect to force production is every single joint has a certain threshold where underneath that you won't get injured, and above that, you will get injured. And that's a different amount for everybody, right? So if this is the amount of force it would take to produce an injury, you want all of your exercise to be lower than that threshold, because the second you go over that, you're going to get hurt. So if you just go out to the bumper of a pickup truck and you just decide to push as hard as you can into that, you could very easily cross that threshold and produce an injury. And you see this a lot with people that lift ballistically or explosively. You should never, ever, ever, ever do any kind of very quick jerking or exploding movement with resistance training. So the idea of going as hard as you can for 7 to 10 seconds with an isometric is terrible, terrible advice, because the amount of force that you're capable of generating with your muscles, the amount that you're capable of, always exceeds the amount, or at least not, I shouldn't say always, initially always exceeds the amount that would produce an injury. You've probably heard that if our muscles were ever fully contract, they would rip themselves off of our bones. It's quite true. Instead, what you want to do with isometrics, and I'll elaborate on this in a bit, is over an appropriate period of time, you want to slowly fatigue the muscles that you're working so that the amount of force that they're capable of generating goes down over time. So if this is the amount of force that would produce an injury, and this is the amount of force that your muscles are capable of generating at the start of the set, you want your muscles to slowly fatigue so that by the time that you get towards the end of your set, you are well underneath that threshold of what may produce an injury. You're still very heavily working the targeted muscles, but at that point, you're contracting with maximum intensity, but the force production is relatively low. And last misconception, I kind of touched on this, is that isometric exercise is not as good as full range of movement or traditional lifting. Again, there are studies showing that isometric exercise is every bit as effective in rehabbing Achilles tendon injuries. This is off of PubMed. Isometric biceps contractions, even with no weight, just maximal flexion of the bicep, or maximal contraction of the bicep held for a static amount of time, produce the same degree of size and strength increases compared to conventional weightlifting. And it also doesn't make sense from, an evolutionary or anthropological sense. Our shoulders are capable of, a wide degree of rotation, flexion, extension, adduction, and abduction. There's a wide variety of movements that our shoulder could perform. But to work certain muscles like the medial deltoid, you don't have to lift until your arm is straight over your head. Most people only do medial delts until they're essentially in a T pose. If you're going to pick up a bag of groceries or do a bicep curl, the way that the bicep flexes the arm, you're capable of almost 180 degrees of movement, but very little of that maintains adequate tension on the biceps, depending on your body positioning. You do not need full range of movement to build muscle. And for the most part, even outside of the gym, people seldom use full range of movement. And teenagers, most adults don't have problem building muscle in the first place. So, how do you do isometrics correctly in a way that is going to minimize force production on the joints and maximize muscular tension and metabolic stress to elicit the best degree of a size and strength increase? Well, first, you need to pick the appropriate position to target whatever muscles you're trying to work. And this is going to be different for someone who's just training for overall health, or maybe wants a bigger chest or bigger glutes or bigger biceps, compared to someone who's training, like I mentioned earlier, like a power lifter trying to lift more weight. Power lifter, yes, should do what they can to strengthen all of the muscles that are being worked at that time, and then probably should directly work that position in the range of movement that they struggle with, not because it's only going to have a limited carryover, but because that's going to most directly target the muscles in the proportion that they're trying to be trained through. But if you're trying to let's just say get bigger quads, and the function of the quad, the biggest leg muscle on the front of your leg, is to extend the lower leg. Muscles are generally strongest in a position about halfway through their range of movement. So you could fold your knees backwards and you could fully extend your leg. And the quad, articulating the knee, has a fairly large range of movement. So if you wanted to do an isometric exercise for the quads, you would set like a leg extension machine for approximately halfway through the range of movement. If your bench is flat, think maybe 30 degrees downward from that. Then what you want to do is, over the course of 60 to 90 seconds, and the reason I pick that time interval is because studies have shown that a time window of about 45 seconds all the way up to 2.5 minutes, so 120 to 150 seconds, you require a longer time under tension with sufficient intensity to fully fatigue all of the type 1 and all of the type 2 muscle fibers. If you just work really, really, really short, brief sets, you're probably never going to recruit a lot of those larger, fast twitch muscles that are most susceptible to size and strength increases. You need a certain minimum amount of time under tension. You also don't want to go too long, because if you go starting to get a little bit longer than 2 minutes, the smaller, weaker, slow twitch muscle fibers start recovering because the load isn't intense enough at that time to keep them fatigued. So science says about 45 seconds to 2.5 minutes. I like to keep all of my sets, whether it's conventional or whether it's isometrics, between 60 and 90 seconds. What you want to do is the first 30 or so seconds, you want to contract about half as hard as you feel that you're capable of contracting. And granted, this is all subjective, but whatever feels about halfway. And over the course of a couple of exercise sessions, you'll get better at doing this, and you'll become more acutely aware of what feels like this relative force production in your body. 30 seconds, about half as hard as you can. The next 30 seconds, about 75% as hard as you can. So a significant increase in force production, even though the weight's not moving, or even though the stack or the object isn't moving. The next 15 seconds, because we just hit a minute, about 90%, so almost as hard as you can go. And then the last 15 seconds, as hard as you dare to try, or I like to put it, as hard as you feel you can safely go. And that's something that you kind of have to be acutely aware of your body, of how everything feels in that moment. If something doesn't feel right in the joints, if there's actual pain, not just discomfort, but if there's pain, you don't want to go that hard. And then the other 2 points I don't want to make is when your time starts, when you change the relative intensity, and when the set is over, you do not just want to immediately load or deload the muscles. You want to gradually, over the course of probably at least 5 or 6 seconds, build up the relative intensity. So when you start your set, you think 3, 2, 1, and you start pushing against this immovable pad, trying to forcibly contract, the muscles of your quads. You hit your stopwatch. You don't just ramp up straight to 50. You want to gradually, over the course of a couple of seconds, push into it. And think of pushing. It's a big difference between if you slowly start pushing somebody and if you just ran up behind them and just hit them as hard as you could. They're big difference in force production. So you gradually build up tension in the muscles until over the course of 5 or 6 seconds, you're pushing at about 50%. Once you get to 30 seconds in, you again gradually ramp up that relative intensity until you're pushing about 75% as hard as you can. When you get to the 1 minute mark, again, over the course of 5 or 6 seconds, you gradually push up to about 90%. And then at 115, you take a couple of seconds and build up to as hard as you safely feel you can go. When your 90 seconds is over, you don't just immediately stop. Similar to how you don't want to load the muscles too quickly because that subjects the joints to a lot of force. You also don't want to deload them very quickly. Ramp down over the course of at least probably 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 seconds, that maximal or near maximal effort, gradually back it off over the course of a good number of seconds, and then complete the exercise. The reason you're doing this again is if this is the amount of force that would produce an injury, most people, before they start a set, are capable of generating far more force than that. And by gradually fatiguing the muscle and by gradually increasing that rate of perceived intensity, the idea is you're going to maintain a lot of tension on the muscle, and mechanical tension and metabolic stress is what produces muscular growth. But you're going to lower that amount of force that you're capable of generating so that when you're exerting that last all-out effort that's as hard as you dare to try, the amount of relative force production that's happening at that moment is really, really, really low. It's a very opposite way from the way most people do isometrics. And again, to directly contrast that with the way it's generally advised, if you were to just sit on that leg extension machine, someone says go, and you immediately snap your legs into force production as hard as you can. One, that's a massive amount of force on the joints. Two, it's not nearly enough time under tension to probably stimulate all of the muscle fibers that you're trying to hit. So that about covers it for isometrics, what they are, what people get wrong, and how to do them correctly. And again, it's my position that if performed correctly, isometric exercise can be every bit as effective and efficient, and in a lot of ways probably safer than the way conventional exercise is done. So thanks for watching, guys. I will see you next time.